You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is about why boundaries are not the solution. Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating these sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws, while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hi, I'm Miriam Susan, the host of the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode. Now, the title might be a little confusing because you may have been taught and you may have been learning that boundaries is the solution to toxic in-laws, that boundaries is the only real way to start reclaiming the peace that your family and that your marriage needs. But I'm going to kind of dispel that myth by saying that it's not the boundaries that can improve your relationship with your in-laws. It's the enforcement of those boundaries that will. So, our scripture reference for today's episode is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 37. And this is from the New Revised Standard Version, Catholic edition of the Bible. And it says, "Let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no." Christ calls us to be clear and truthful in our words and actions. And that's why trying to set boundaries, explaining boundaries to your in-laws, and not enforcing them is actually what may be the problem that you're experiencing right now with your in-laws. One of the things we need to ask ourselves as Catholic women is it right? Is it the right thing to do to enforce boundaries? Well, let's turn to the Catechism number 1738 that says, "Freedom is exercised in relationships between human beings. Every human person, created in the image of God, has the natural right to be recognized as a free and responsible being." So, what does that mean? It means that we have the right to act and be an autonomous human being. Now, one of the issues that many of us have with toxic in laws is that they seem to act like we're just an extension of them. We're an extension of their family, and we're not allowed to have our own independent thoughts, independent opinions. And that goes against what the Catholic Church teaches. Enforcement of our boundaries not only honors our own God-given dignity, but it also honors our in-laws' God-given dignity, because we are individuals. We are created, each of us created in the image of God. And that's why we both can benefit from having boundaries. It honors them as saying, you are separate from me, I am separate from you. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. Now, when we allow boundary violations, part of it might be that we just never really thought about how we would enforce our boundaries. So that has to come first, obviously. If we're going to set a boundary, we have to be ready and willing to enforce it. Now, it's not always easy to do, is it? Sometimes if you have very volatile in-laws, that can be extremely challenging. But we cannot allow boundary violations because it opens the door to spiritual harm. Now, how is that? How can us saying that, it's okay if we allow our kids to spend time with their grandparents, even though the last time they went over there, the grandparents allowed some very inappropriate things on the television. So how does standing firm in that boundary prevent spiritual harm? Well, when we allow others to disregard our boundaries, it teaches other people that disrespecting us, disrespecting our individual desires and preferences, or disrespecting our authority as our children's parents, it teaches them that it is acceptable to do that. Allowing our in-laws, when anybody really, to violate and ignore our boundaries can also lead to us holding resentment against that person. when really it's our responsibility to enforce the boundaries. Yes, it would be nice if everybody heard our boundaries and everybody decided that they were going to follow them to the letter. But that's not very realistic, is it? It's on us to ensure that we enforce it. And so if we don't enforce our boundaries, we can become angry and bitter and resentful towards the people that are violating it. But really, the onus is on us to enforce them. It also can prevent the other person, the person who's violating the boundaries, from growing in virtues like patience and kindness and being gentle and loving. It can also damage our own relationship with God. If we are regularly suppressing, tucking away, ignoring our God given dignity, then we're not living as God wants us to live. And that can start to erode our own relationship with our Creator. As Catholics, it is vital for our lives to be grounded in truth. Truth needs to be a foundation in our lives. And enforcing our boundaries aligns with Catholic teaching on truth, because truth is not just about speaking facts, but living in an authentic and genuine way. When we enforce our boundaries, we are a witness to the reality of our God given worth. If we have no worth, then what's the point of having boundaries? That means anybody can walk all over us. It doesn't matter because we're nothing. But that's not true. God has given us worth just because we exist. So when we enforce our boundaries, we're saying, I have worth. I have my own worth outside of you, outside of anybody else. And I should be respected because of that. Now, clearly enforcing our boundaries reflects God's own nature. He is always truthful about his boundaries. It's very easy to go back and look at the story of Adam and Eve and the fall. God told Adam and Eve, if you eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And guess what? We do. We all die now, and we all carry that original sin from birth until we are baptized, because God made true on his promise. When we consistently enforce our boundaries, it also demonstrates that we have integrity between the words that we speak and our actions. It's kind of like as a parent, when we have a child who maybe is a picky eater, and you tell them, if you don't finish what's on your plate, or usually with our family, it's if you don't at least take a thank you bite of all the foods on your plate and eat several bites of the things that I know the kids will eat, then there's no snack, period. If they're not hungry enough to eat their dinner, they don't get a snack. Now, if I don't consistently enforce that, then my kids learn that it doesn't matter if they eat their dinner or not. They're going to get a snack anyway. So it's very important for us, even with our in-laws, even with adults, to clearly and consistently enforce our boundaries to show that we are in integrity with what we say and with what we do. Now, there is a relationship between enforcing boundaries and authentic Christian charity. If we continually allow somebody to take advantage of us, to disrespect us, not only is it bad for us, but it's bad for the other person. We're enabling them to sin against us. We're opening the door to a near occasion of sin. And I don't know about you, but at the end of my life, when I meet God and I'm held accountable for everything that I've done, I don't want anything extra like that on my plate. I don't need enabling somebody else's sin to be on my plate. I've got enough that I'm going to deal with on my own, let alone being someone who enabled a near occasion of sin for somebody else. Now, kindness and firmness we can often see as opposites, but they're not. And I'm going to explain to you why. Christ modeled perfect love and clear boundaries. He modeled perfect love, of course, because he is and was, during his time on earth, perfect. But he also had clear boundaries. If he wanted somebody to come with him, that was it. And he told everybody else to stay behind. He didn't waver on that. If he needed to get away, he got away. He didn't waver on that. You can have boundaries. You can be firm and still be kind and still be loving. True kindness includes helping others understand what their impact is on other people. So it's important if your in-laws stress your kids out. It's important not for you to tell your in-laws, hey, you're stressing the kids out, not for you to say that in an ugly way, but you can say, if you have a child, let's say, who is not very touchy-feely, and your father-in-law is, he loves to give hugs, he loves to give kisses, he loves to snuggle, but you have a child who does not. It is important for you to stand up for your child and let them know, you know what? My son doesn't really like that. Can you just sit over here and we can read a book together? You can find ways to be kind and allow your in-laws and anybody really in your child's life to spend time with them, but it cannot be in such a way that negatively impacts your child. You can find ways to guard that for your child, guard that boundary for your child with your in-laws, if that's the case. And really, it's an opportunity for you to allow a relationship that's healthier between your child and your in-laws, rather than just allowing your father-in-law to be snuggly, cuddly, kissy with your child. And then your child becomes anxious. Your child becomes resentful. Your child starts to pull away. And your in-laws don't know why, and then they get hurt. But if you can stand up and say, you know what, he doesn't really like that. Hopefully they take it the right way. But even so, allowing that boundary between your child and your in-laws is a way for you to be kind to both of them.
Hi, Miriam Susan here. I wanted to point out a new feature for you to reach out with any questions that you might have. It is an audio message submission option on my website, desiringpeace.com/podcast. If you have any questions, if you just want to reach out, if you just want to tell me, hey, thank you, I really appreciated this episode, I would absolutely love to hear from you. If you decide to submit a question, it could be chosen to be played here on the podcast or for me to just answer it if it makes more sense for me to just address your question without playing your audio. But I will be in touch if you reach out. Just send me a quick note. Go to desiringpeace.com/podcast. Submit your audio message now.
Now, being firm without being cruel does honor both you and your in-laws. It does. It allows you the opportunity to assert your Christian individuality, your God-given dignity as an individual. And it also, as you're being firm, honors that they're another person created in the image of God. And they do deserve a certain level of respect. Now, being permissive, we are often taught incorrectly that is the same as Christian charity. And it's not, for all the reasons that I've already said. Being charitable, being loving, doesn't mean allowing things to happen that shouldn't happen. And I'm not even talking about illegal or truly abusive things. I'm talking about just basic things that you allow to happen against your will, against your desire, against your children's wills and their desires. That's not the same as charity. What can come from faithful, consistent enforcement of boundaries with your in-laws? Well, for one thing, it creates an opportunity for a genuine and healthy relationship to happen. And it can also allow for healing. If you enforce boundaries between you, your husband, your children, your whole family, and your in-laws, it gives you time to heal. It also gives them time to see what's going on, and God willing, for them to repent and change their actions. Clear enforcement can actually reduce family tension long term, especially if your in-laws are receptive to these boundaries and to their enforcement. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case with our family. It has not healed the relationship. We have healed, and we're still in the process of healing, but it hasn't healed the relationship because it has to be both sides. Both sides have to be respectful. Both sides have to be willing to honor the boundaries. And when one side doesn't, then obviously that relationship is not going to get better. I will say that the spiritual growth that comes through standing in truth and standing and enforcing your boundaries can be awe-inspiring. My husband's and my relationship with God is far deeper, it's far stronger than it was before things blew up with his parents. We had to set a line. We had to say, this is enough, and then follow up with the actions that that boundary needed in order for us to experience this depth of a relationship with God that we have now that we didn't have before. And it has allowed us to have a deeper relationship with the Blessed Mother that we did not have before. Enforcing our boundaries can absolutely be an act of mercy. Just like I talked about not enabling sin. If we continue to allow our in-laws to sin against us, that is a greater burden that they have to carry into eternity. Whether your in-laws are Christian or not, whether they are Catholic or not, whether they are totally living apart from God, we can do our part to help lessen that burden, that spiritual baggage that they're going to take into eternity if we just enforce our boundaries. It is merciful to say one thing and enforce it and mean it in such a way that it prevents our in-laws from acting in sin and sinning against us. Enforcing boundaries can become almost like a spiritual practice. It is and can often be an act of denial of what maybe we are impulsively drawn to do. Many of us are just naturally drawn to be permissive, naturally drawn to just finding a way to make it get better, even if it's not the right decision. Allowing us this opportunity to practice actively being gentle and kind with our words, to actively practice being self-controlled. Boundaries allow us to be self-controlled. When we enforce a boundary, let's say our in-laws insist on calling at inopportune times. Maybe they like to call right as you're getting ready to get the kids into bed. You're in your bedtime routine and they call and they want to talk and they want to talk to the kids. And you know what happens when they call because they get all worked up and they get all excited, or they get fussy because they're tired and they just need to go to bed. Having boundaries that you enforce allows you to not snap. It allows you to not act out in those ways that you end up having to go to confession about because you're not acting in a charitable and loving and gracious way towards your in-laws. If you don't have those boundaries and you don't enforce them, chances are that's what happens. You snap, you get ugly, you get frustrated, you get bitter. When if you just said, we have told you that we're not going to answer the phone during the kids' bedtime routine because it disrupts everything, but we'll talk to you later. That can be a spiritual practice. That can allow you to get control and exercise that control over your emotions, over your impulses to lash out instead of doing just that. Lashing out, being angry, being bitter, snapping at your husband, snapping at your kids because you're frustrated and anxious because of these interruptions. When really, what we need to do is enforce a boundary. I know it can be so very difficult to enforce boundaries. I know it can, because it's probably not something that you grew up doing. It's probably not something that is second nature to you. It's probably not something that you have been doing already in your marriage, but it absolutely is essential if you want to have a healthy family. If you constantly are having outside influences that are disrupting your family, that are disrupting your children's lives, you can't continue to allow that to happen. The boundaries have to be put in place and they have to be enforced. The clearest example that I have about boundaries is actual physical country borders. Our family has traveled extensively around the world, and whenever you come into a new country, you have to prove that you have a right to be there. And if you don't, they just don't even let you come in. As we respect other countries' borders, their boundaries, that is what we can do with our in-laws. We can say, this is where our family's turf ends. This is where our family unit, our country, our little individual country ends. And this is the outside. You want permission to come into here, you need to be invited and you need to follow the rules. Yes, it sounds harsh to say that you have rules for your in-laws because they're adults. But if they really acted like adults, if they really acted like they cared about you and your family and your individuality and your autonomy, then you probably wouldn't have these thoughts and these conversations that you probably have with your husband about boundaries. That was an eye-opening thing talking with my adult daughters when I interviewed them. And they said, we didn't have boundaries per se with my family, with my mom and dad, like we did with my husband's family, because they were always encroaching and wanting more and more and more. My husband's parents were, whereas my parents were and have always been much more laid back. You decide, this is your family. You make the decisions. If you want to come on Christmas, that's great. If not, we understand you want to do things for Christmas your way. On the other hand, with my in-laws, it felt like it was almost a personal affront if we decided to not go see them on Christmas Day. It was just a very different philosophy and very different view of our family versus my parents. And my children picked up on the fact that we didn't have boundaries with my parents because they respected our decisions. They respected us as individuals. They respected us as an individual and autonomous family unit. And we didn't have that with my in-laws. So my hope for this episode is that it empowers you to do what you need to do and enforce the boundaries that you have. And maybe you haven't set any boundaries yet, or maybe you just have been mulling them around in your head and you haven't really vocalized them. Sometimes you don't need to say your boundaries to your in-laws. Sometimes that makes things worse because then it seems like you're trying to control them. Sometimes you just have the boundaries and you don't say anything, but you enforce them. Like if your boundary is our kids don't spend the night anywhere, and your in-laws keep asking them to spend the night, say, no, we just don't do that. We just don't spend the night. No, we just don't let our kids spend the night outside the house, period. You don't have to tell them, we don't allow them to spend the night at your house because da, 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 da. You just have a boundary and you stick to it. Well, God bless you this week as you consider this idea that, boundaries are important, yes, but they're not the solution. The solution really is whether you enforce them or not. Go in peace.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you've ever wondered just how toxic your relationship with your in-laws really is, I've got the perfect tool for you. Introducing the new free Toxic In-Laws Assessment, a self-graded quiz designed to help you identify the true level of toxicity in your relationship with your in-laws. Whether you're unsure if your in-laws are really that bad or you think they might be worse than you realize, this assessment will give you the clarity you need. Don't leave it to guesswork. Take the free Toxic In-Laws Assessment now and start your journey towards healthier and more peaceful family dynamics. Visit desiringpeace.com/quiz to get started. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and/or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.